Chapter 8 Last Straw, Part 2. This better be important, or whoever woke me this late is going to regret it bitterly. Ida grumbled sleepily after Hootie had woken her up with an overly thrilled, "We have visitors!" in the middle of the night. It had been beyond difficult for her to fall asleep, which made her all the less thrilled to be awoken like this. She rubbed her eyes and climbed out of her nest, yawning. She was still half asleep by the time she got downstairs and opened the door. Then suddenly wide awake when she realized the Blight Twins were standing at her doorstep. "What are you doing here?" "Hi, Ida." Edric looked at her with a tired, broken smile and pulled the cloak a little tighter around him. It was freezing out here, although that wasn't the only reason he was shaking. He looked both of them over and concluded that 1, they didn't look great, and 2, this definitely counted as important. "Geez, you two look terrible." Ida's look softened. "Come on in." "Thank you." Emerald didn't even manage to fake a smile when she stepped inside. She dropped the bags onto the floor and pretty much collapsed on the nearest couch, and from that moment on, would have been unable to get back up even if she wanted to. Her body had been rebelling against her all the way here, and while she managed not to pass out, her exhaustion did properly catch up to her now. Edric stood in the middle of the living room awkwardly, rubbing out one arm and eyes examining the floorboard. He placed the bag he was holding next to the other two, but still didn't sit down afterwards. Ida closed the door behind them and looked at her guest worriedly. Whatever had happened, it had to be severe if the twins had risked getting caught in the rain because of it. Thankfully, they hadn't been, but the thunder outside made it clear that it had been a little too close for comfort. Because of how cloudy it had been in the evening, Ida had cast a rain protection spell on the house before she'd gone to sleep, so they were safe in here. Before she could decide what to say or ask, Emma spoke up again. "Can we—" She hesitated for a moment. "Can we stay here for a bit? Just a couple of days?" "Sure. It's more convenient for working on the portal if you stay here anyway." Well, that was part of her reasoning at least. The more mushy one that she would have never admitted out loud was that she'd grown sort of accustomed to helping witches in need. Luz really had rubbed off on her in that regard. Besides, Ida knew all too well what it was like to run away from home. "Thank you. Really." Emma managed a weak smile. "Don't sweat it. It was getting a little dull without Luz around here." Ida looked from one twin to the other. "Do you guys need anything?" Edric chewed his lip and continued to analyze the floor for a while before speaking up. "Could I have something for my cheek?" Ida nodded. The vague assumption she had about how he'd gotten the bruise on his cheek made her stomach twist. "Of course. I've never been particularly great with healing magic, but we can get you some ice." She drew a small spell circle and handed him an icicle wrapped in a piece of fabric a moment later. "And since that's something I've had to tell Luce before, just hold it against your cheek. Don't lick it. Remember to take it off the injury every 5 to 10 minutes so you don't overstrain the area." He nodded and took the wrapped ice from her with a somber expression, muttering a silent "got it" before he sat down on the empty couch and held the fabric against his cheek in silence. He didn't like how it felt. Ida looked at the two teens on her couches with an uncertain expression. She wanted to help them not feel so alone and so lost in this, but she didn't know how. She wasn't even sure what she'd have told her younger self if she had the chance. "Do you kids want to talk about it or something?" She wanted to at least extend the offer. Edric looked like he was about to say something, but Emma beat him to it. "We actually came here partly because we hoped you wouldn't ask," she mumbled quietly. "Can you please just cast a sleep spell on me?" She looked like she was about to pass out any moment either way, but the desperation in her voice was enough for Ida to hear the actual meaning of "I don't want to dream" in the words, despite her own state of utter exhaustion. "Sure, you might want to change into something more comfortable first, though." Emma shook her head. She didn't have it in her to do anything she didn't consider absolutely unavoidable, and changing wasn't on that list. The adrenaline had ebbed away completely now, and all that remained were anger and sadness and a strong, painful feeling of emptiness that swallowed her whole. She just wanted to curl up into a ball and cry for the next several hours, but she knew if she did, her brother would try to comfort her. The last thing he needed right now, as upset as he was and after everything that he'd just been through, was to be an emotional crutch for anyone else. The least she could do for Edric right now, and as ashamed as that made her, the only thing she thought herself capable of doing at the moment was to spare him the additional weight of her leaning on him when he was the one that so desperately needed someone to lean on. I'm weak, and a coward, and a bad sister. Emra still couldn't stop thinking about Amity's broken sobs. But now they were joined by Edric's desperate voice and the burning pain in her own lower arms and wrists. And the weight on her shoulders was so heavy it threatened to crush her right then and there. She used the last of her strength to build her facade up again, to make sure her face didn't betray any of these emotions. Her shaking voice probably would have, which was why she avoided speaking any more than she had to when she pulled her blanket and pillow out of her bag and used them to make herself a little more comfortable on the couch. The familiar weight was not as calming as she hoped it would be. The warmth of the room and the blanket wasn't enough for her body to stop shaking. The cold had never been the issue. Not really. Now, please? Her voice was weak, and she was on the brink of breaking down again when wonderfully, her whole body went numb and all thoughts vanished from her head, leaving it completely empty except for her exhaustion. Her breaths evened out when comforting darkness embraced her. What about you? Ida asked Edric as soon as she was sure Emma was sound asleep. Want to opt for a sleep spell too? He hesitated for a moment. Forgetting about everything for a few hours seemed like a nice option. But he was too restless to even try and think about sleep, so he shook his head. Thanks, but I don't think I'll stay up a bit longer. Don't let me keep you up, though. It's more than enough that you're letting us stay here in the first place. You sure? Ida wasn't sure she liked the thought of leaving him alone right now. Then again, maybe he needed to be alone for a bit. Yeah, please, go back to sleep. She hesitated, but Edric insisted twice more, and so she went back upstairs. He felt guilty enough for waking her up in the first place. He didn't want to keep her up all night. And it didn't matter if he ended up getting no sleep at all. At least then, he'd be able to watch over Emra. Someone had to, after all. She'd been braver today than he could ever be. Thank you for saving me. He wasn't sure if he'd have dared to leave if it hadn't been for his sister. The courage she'd shown standing up to their parents was what had given him the strength to be as brave as well. He waited until Ida had turned off the lights upstairs before he took what he thought was his bag to find something to distract himself with. It wasn't until he saw the Odoman book inside that he realized he grabbed the wrong one. But he decided that reading was as good as a distraction as any, and so he took out Amity's favorite children's book and started reading. It didn't take long for him to regret that decision. The further he read, the more tears rolled down his cheeks. It was everything about the book that was too much right now. The fact that it belonged to Amity and that it was her favorite, and that it was about loneliness and longing for friends. Was that why it had been her favorite? Because she'd always felt so alone? Edric's worst fear was ending up lonely and abandoned, and yet, he let his parents make Amity live through it. He hadn't intervened. He hadn't even made an effort to try and be her friend after things with Willow had gone awry. We haven't been very good siblings to you lately, have we? He lowered his head and hugged the book to his chest, silently sobbing to himself. I'm so sorry, Vince. I'm so sorry. Luce, what is it now? Ida rubbed her eyes sleepily. During the last couple of months, she'd gotten so used to Luce waking her up in the middle of the night, usually because she discovered a great new way to change a glyph, which wasn't something Ida was thrilled to be woken up to see at 3 in the morning. Despite the pride she felt every time Luce learned a new spell, that she immediately assumed the person that had walked into her room to wake her up had to be Luce. It took her a moment to wake up enough to remember that it couldn't be Luce. That the girl that had stayed with her for the past months was gone now, as far out of reach as she possibly could be, and that Ida might not see her again for a very long time. Instead of Luce, Edric Blight was standing in the doorframe. He looked at her apologetically. Sorry, I know it's late. I should just... Ida yawned as she slowly rose out of her nest. It's fine, really. Luce did this all the time, so I'm used to it. Funnily enough, despite the girl constantly waking her up in the middle of the night, she'd actually slept better with Luce around than she had in years before meeting her. I still shouldn't have barged in the way I did, especially after I told you to go back to sleep earlier. He rubbed the back of his neck sheepishly. Like I said, it's okay. Quit apologizing already. Ida gave him a sympathetic look. Can't sleep, huh, kid? Edric shook his head. Did you change your mind about the sleep spell? I could guarantee it would let you sleep dreamlessly. Or I could even make you dream about something nice. Just tell me which one of them you want. None, actually. He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck again. He was starting to sweat from nerves. Not that I don't appreciate the offer. I do, but I still don't really feel like sleeping. This might sound stupid, but can we just talk for a bit? Ida shrugged, then gave Edric a small, tired smile. Oh, what the heck. Sleep's overrated anyway. You want to stay up here or go back downstairs? His face lit up immediately. Can we go back downstairs? I want to be there in case Em wakes up. He bit his lip. I don't think she should be alone right now. He knew he wouldn't have wanted to be alone when he woke up after everything that had happened tonight, so he wouldn't risk putting her through that. No matter how much she put on a brave face, it was pretty obvious that she was just as shaken up as he was. Ida nodded. Sure, she should be out for at least 6 more hours. But if it makes you feel better, we can go sit down on the couch downstairs. Thank you. But I'm not going to wake up Hootie again. Can't have him be sleepy tomorrow or the lights will be out of whack all day, she said, stretching her arms and yawning once more as they made their way downstairs. That's fine. He needs to sleep just like the rest of us. I feel kind of bad for waking him earlier. I think we startled him a little when we got here, cloaks and all. After initially almost attacking them because he hadn't recognized them, Hootie had greeted them very excitedly though. Yeah, probably, but he'll be fine. Ida cast a light spell, the one that had been Luce's specialty, so the living room wasn't pitch black when they entered. Edric sat down on the couch and pulled his blanket from his back to cover his legs. The book he stopped reading a while ago was still sitting on the table. Do you want some apple blood? Something to eat? Both? I don't really feel like eating, but something to drink sounds great. Noted. Ida took one of the juice boxes from the kitchen shelf and handed it to him before she sat down on the couch as well, keeping an appropriate amount of distance from him. Thanks. You're the one that's doing me a favor, really. We have like 40 more of these, so feel free to drink as many as you want. I have to get rid of them somehow. Soft apple blood reminded her too much of lunch at Hexite's cafeteria to like it. But Luce had been a bit picky when it came to which fluids she actually liked, and so Ida had made sure to have them in stock. Still, they sat there in silence with the boy slurping for a bit, and Ida hesitated and waited for him to finish the box before carefully asking, How's your cheek? Edric winced. It's okay, kid. We don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. No, It's alright. It feels a bit better, he mumbled after a moment. But my cheek isn't the part that hurts the most. I know this doesn't help much right now, but I'm really sorry. Thank you. He bit his quivering lip and willed it to still to keep himself from breaking down tears again. And it does help, if only a little. Sometimes knowing that there was someone who cared made all the difference. Do you want to tell me what's happened or talk about something else to keep your mind off everything? I'll be here to listen either way. It's your call. After a bit of hesitation, he started talking. Over the next 2 hours, Edric opened up and told Ida about everything that had happened on the past evening after they left the Owl House. How they'd made Amity cry, and what had happened with their parents after. He had to pause several times when the memories became too much. And the part where his mother had hit him, he wasn't able to say out loud. But when he finished, the weight on his heart didn't feel quite as crushing anymore, and he felt less alone. It wasn't suddenly okay. It was far from that, and he was sure it would never actually be completely okay. But it helped. At least a little, and right now even a little made a huge difference to him. The only good thing about this messed up situation is that Amity is as far out of their reach as she'll ever be. They can't do anything to hurt her where she is, he mumbled. It was the only thought that was the slightest bit consoling to him right now. What she'd heard made Ida feel sick and furious. You kids can stay here as long as you want, okay? I knew your parents were terrible people, but if I'd had any idea how bad it really was... At least they were out of there now. They'd be safe here. But she still wished she had the ability to turn back time to prevent them from going through all this in the first place. Nobody deserved to be hurt like this, especially not by someone whose job should have been to protect them. Edric shook his head. It's not your fault. We're not your responsibility. You are now, she said without hesitation. How she'd gone from never really thinking about having children before meeting King and then Luce to basically being ready to take in just about any child her unofficially adopted daughter had brought home. Ida wasn't sure, but she had no regrets. Do you want one of these parallel arm things Luce always does? A hug? Edric blinked in surprise. We don't have to. I just thought, since it always made her feel better when she was down and sometimes it made me feel better, maybe it would help you too? He didn't even reply, and instead just pulled her close with an energy that reminded Ida a lot of Luce, even if it didn't quite reach her level. She patted his back a bit awkwardly, and they remained frozen like that for a while before he finally let go of her again. Thanks. I really needed that. He couldn't even remember the last time his parents had held him like that, or the last time he'd felt remotely comfortable or even safe in their presence for that matter. Tian, how did I miss so many red flags? It made him sick to even think about that. Ida gave him a kind smile. Don't sweat it. If you need any help kicking Odia's and Alador's butts if they ever bother you again, or because of tonight's incident, all you have to do is ask. Edric bit his lip. Thanks. That meant a lot to him, despite the fact that he was more than unlikely to ever take her up on the offer. Answering violence with more violence would cause them more trouble than it was worth. And he'd much rather forget these two existed altogether than waste even more time and energy on them than he already had. Still, he couldn't help but wonder, how do you know our parents? Ida sighed. I went to school with them, unfortunately. They hadn't even been in the same grade. Alador and Odalia were a bit younger than her, although far from as much as most people would have assumed based on her appearance. But she still run across them outside of class a couple more times than she would have preferred, and she had learned to dislike them rather quickly. Bunch of buttholes, even back then. Your mom especially. I constantly saw her tormenting people because she thought that was fun. She even stole my sister's lunch money once. Ida cracked a smile at the memory. I made her regret that one, though. Edric looked at her, super confused. Why would she steal anyone's lunch money? Her family has always been super rich. Ida crossed her arms. Oh, she didn't do it because she needed the money. She did it because it made Lily cry. She liked making people cry. The most surprising thing about this was that Odalia had even dared to do that at all, because Lilith had been at least 3 grades above her from what Ida remembered. But for some reason, that girl had always been under the somewhat delusional impression that she was untouchable because she came from an influential family. Apparently, she hasn't changed much since high school, Ida thought grimly. To her surprise, Edric almost laughed. Well, that explains why she was so tense when Lilith showed up at the manor to pick up Amity for training for the first time. Because of what she'd done to Amity, Lilith was just below his parents on the list of people he disliked the most on the entire Boiling Isles right now. But, remembering his mother's distraught face after hearing that the head of the Emperor's Coven would be training her youngest daughter with the added context of said head of the Emperor's Coven being someone she had been caught pickpocketing from as a student was almost enough to make him smile. And then, she walked on eggshells around Lilith for years, hoping and praying that Lilith would never bring the situation up around anyone important, and maybe even that she'd forgotten about it, but never quite sure she had. And it wasn't like she could have just asked. It was nice to know that karma had bit her at least once, even if it was in favor of another person that Edric didn't like very much. Ida raised an eyebrow. You didn't know? I can't believe Lily didn't mention it. I mean, she does a decent job at hiding it when she's supposed to be professional, but believe it or not, my sister is actually super petty. Really? Edric raised an eyebrow. I have a hard time imagining that, considering her focus on winning the most righteous, stuck-up witch on the entire Boiling Isles competition. Illusion magic was excellent for air quotes, if nothing else. Ida snorted. She was starting to like this kid. Yeah, really. When we were younger, there wasn't a single time I stuck out my tongue at Lily that she didn't stick hers out at me in return, even after we became teens, she sighed melancholic. This might sound stupid, but I sort of missed the silly fights we had as kids. Ida didn't let it show much, but she was actually pretty worried about her sister because of how drastically she'd changed. She was livid because of what Lilith had done to Luce and Amity, and Ida doubted that was something she could ever forgive her sister for. But there were moments where she suddenly remembered what their relationship had been like when they were younger, and then for a few seconds, she just missed getting into dumb heated arguments about which stupid spell that they'd learned was more powerful, or who thought would win the next professional Grudge championship, or why Ida's favorite book was definitely 1,000 times better than Lilith's, or which one they thought had the worst taste in music. It was weird how much she missed that. On some days, she'd have given anything to have it back. But if what had happened with Luce and Amity hadn't finally been enough to make Lilith realize that what she was doing was wrong, then nothing would ever get through to her. The Bellas had already taken everything Ida had ever loved and admired in her older sister and warped it into a shadow of the person who had once been, into someone that truly only lived to receive orders and execute them, without ever stopping to question if she was doing the right thing. After everything you've done, do I even still know you at all? It's not stupid, Edric replied and gave Ida's shoulder a squeeze, interrupting her thoughts. Wanting to go back to how things used to be, I mean. But sometimes you can't. Sometimes something you want is already gone or it was never there in the first place, and you've just been in denial about it for a long time. He sighed, thinking back to everything it had taken for him to finally accept the reality of the situation with his parents. That's hard to accept. It hurts. But somehow you have to. Because if you don't, you can't move on and be happy again. Not really. Ida smiled and ruffled his hair. Huh. You're a smart kid, aren't you? Edric shook his head and chuckled. Thanks. I think it's a sleep deprivation. Ida laughed for a moment. She couldn't help but imagine Luce's reaction as well. The girl's laugh was the world's most annoyingly wonderful sound in the world, and Ida missed it beyond words. She sighed. Spending so much time talking to Edric really made her miss her daughter even more than she already had. Maybe she could at least keep calling Luce, even when they had nothing new to report about the portal, just so that Ida could see her daughter and Amity. Just so that she was sure they were both okay. She might not have been able to actually hug Luce or ruffle her hair, but at least she could still see her and hear her voice. The thoughts made her feel happier. They stayed up just sitting there and talking about anything and everything for Titan knew how long. And it made both of them feel somewhat better. They got along well. Edric wasn't sure how much time had passed when he finally fell asleep. And just like Ida had promised, he didn't dream. End of chapter.